The morning sun cast long shadows across Fort Bennink's parade ground as Captain Sarah Mitchell stood at attention outside the commandant's office. It was June 1944, and the war in the Pacific was reaching its most brutal phase. Sarah had been stationed at the base for 2 years, rising through the ranks despite the constant sideways glances from the male officers. She was one of only 3 female officers in the entire camp, and she'd had to prove herself twice as hard as any man. Colonel Henderson sat behind his heavy wooden desk, not bothering to look up from the papers in front of him. Sarah could see the dismissal in his posture before he even spoke. "Captain Mitchell," he began, still not meeting her eyes, "we have a situation that needs managing." Sarah straightened her spine. She'd learned long ago that when officers couldn't look at you, they were about to assign you something they considered beneath notice. This was how things worked in 1944. The men got the glory. The women got the jobs nobody else wanted. "The Japanese prisoners who arrived last week," Henderson continued, finally glancing at her with an expression that suggested he'd just tasted something sour. "They're not adjusting well. The guards report resistance, refusal to cooperate. Someone needs to oversee the integration and processing of the new arrivals. I'm assigning you to handle the administrative oversight." It wasn't a question. It was an assignment wrapped in the kind of tone that suggested Sarah should be grateful for any work at all. Administrative oversight of captured enemy soldiers. It was clerical work with a military title. It was exactly the kind of task designed to keep women out of the real action, out of real command. Sarah's jaw tightened, but her voice remained steady. "Yes, sir. When do I begin?" "Tomorrow, report to Compound C at 600 hours. He waved his hand dismissively, already reaching for the next file on his desk. "And Mitchell, don't screw this up. These prisoners are unpredictable. You'll have a security detail, of course. Try not to get in over your head." The implication hung in the air between them like cigarette smoke. A woman commanding anything, even paperwork, was already something he questioned. The idea that she might actually be capable of handling a complex situation with prisoners of war was apparently laughable to Colonel Henderson. Sarah saluted, turned on her heel, and left the office without another word. Outside, the summer heat wrapped around her like a blanket. The Georgia humidity made every breath feel heavy. She walked toward the barracks, her mind already working through what awaited her. She'd read the reports on the Japanese prisoners of war. They were from the recent fighting in the Pacific. Most had been captured during brutal island campaigns. Many were traumatized. Many had been told by their own military that American soldiers would torture and kill them if they surrendered. Now they were locked behind barbed wire in rural Georgia, far from home, terrified and angry. And she was the one expected to manage them. Back in her small quarters, Sarah reviewed the files that had been prepared. 23 Japanese prisoners, ages ranging from 19 to 41. Most were junior officers or enlisted men. All of them were considered dangerous. The guards had reported that several refused to speak to the American soldiers. 2 had attempted to escape. 1 had attacked a guard with a piece of broken metal, though the attack was quickly stopped. Sarah understood what had happened here. The Army had looked at this situation, saw it was difficult and potentially dangerous, and had thought to themselves, "Let's give it to the female officer. If it goes well, it's not a significant achievement. If it goes badly, it confirms what many of them already believed, that women couldn't handle real military responsibility." It was a setup. What they didn't know was that Sarah Mitchell had spent her entire life being underestimated. She was the daughter of a factory worker and a schoolteacher in Kansas. Her father had wanted her to go to nursing school. Her mother had urged her to marry young and focus on family. When she joined the Army, the recruiting officer had actually laughed and asked her if she was looking for the secretarial pool. Sarah had spent her entire military career proving people wrong, and she wasn't about to stop now. She spent that night planning. She read through every report on the prisoners, trying to understand not just what they'd done, but who they were. She studied Japanese military hierarchy. She read accounts from the Pacific campaigns that tried to explain how Japanese soldiers thought, what their expectations were, what they feared. By midnight, her small room was covered with papers and maps. By dawn, Sarah had a strategy. She knew she couldn't win over the prisoners by treating them like soldiers. The war had made that impossible, but she might win them over by treating them like men. Compound C sat at the edge of the base, a series of low barracks surrounded by 2 layers of barbed wire fence. Armed guards stood at every corner. As Sarah approached in the early morning light, she could see the prisoners through the fence. They were sitting in small groups, most of them silent and withdrawn. Their uniforms were worn and stained. Some bore bandages from old wounds. The guard commander, Sergeant Earl Patterson, met her at the gate. He was a thick-necked man in his 50s with a permanent scowl that suggested he'd never smiled in his life. He didn't hide his skepticism when he saw Sarah approach. "Ma'am," he said, his tone making it clear that ma'am was not a sign of respect. "The commandant said we'd have an officer overseeing operations. Didn't think he meant a female officer." Sarah met his eyes and didn't flinch. "The commandant assigned me to administrative oversight of Compound C. That means everything that happens here goes through my authorization. Everything. Do you understand?" Sergeant Patterson's face flushed slightly. He was clearly not used to taking orders from a woman, but he was also career military, which meant he understood hierarchy. "Yes, ma'am." "Walk me through the compound," Sarah said. "I want to see everything, and I want to hear about every single incident that's occurred since these prisoners arrived." As they walked, Sarah listened carefully. There had been the escape attempts, the attack on the guard. There had also been several prisoners who simply refused to eat. 3 of them had developed a fever that the camp doctor was treating, but Patterson made it clear he suspected it was psychological, that they were faking illness to gain attention or avoid labor assignments. Sarah absorbed all of it, filing it away. What she was hearing was the story of traumatized men who had been told their entire lives that surrender meant death, and who were now imprisoned far from home, terrified, with no control over their situation. "Show me the kitchen area," Sarah said. Patterson looked confused. "Ma'am." "The kitchen, where you prepare the prisoners' meals." "It's this way, but—" Sarah walked straight ahead, not waiting for permission. She needed to see everything that touched these men's lives. After the kitchen, she asked to see the medical area, then the latrine, then the exercise yard. She was methodical and thorough, and by the time she was done, Sergeant Patterson was clearly wondering what the hell the captain was up to. Finally, Sarah stood in the center of the compound and looked at the prisoners who had gathered to stare at this unusual sight, an American woman officer in their compound. "Gather them," she told Patterson, "all of them in the main yard now." Patterson hesitated. "Ma'am, I don't think—" "That wasn't a request, Sergeant." Within 20 minutes, all 23 prisoners were standing in rough lines in the exercise yard. They watched Sarah with a mixture of fear, confusion, and curiosity. She was the first woman most of them had seen since their capture. She was also an officer, which meant authority, which meant potential danger. Sarah stepped forward so they could see her clearly. She had no idea if any of them spoke English, but her voice was steady and strong. "My name is Captain Sarah Mitchell," she said slowly, clearly, making sure each word was distinct. "I am now in charge of this compound. I am giving you new rules." She paused, letting that sink in. "First rule, you will be treated with dignity. You are prisoners of war, protected under the Geneva Convention. That protection will be enforced while you are in my command." She could see some of the prisoners exchanging glances. They had not expected this. "Second rule, you will be fed properly. You will receive adequate medical care. You will be allowed reasonable exercise time." Sarah walked slowly along the lines of prisoners, making eye contact where she could. "Third rule, any man who attempts to escape will be punished according to military law. Any man who commits violence against another prisoner or a guard will be punished, but any man who follows the rules will be treated fairly." She stopped and addressed them all once more. "I am a military officer. I understand discipline. I understand that you are frightened and angry. I understand that you believed you would be executed if you surrendered. You were lied to. But you can choose what kind of prisoners you will be. You can choose to comply with the rules and make your time here as bearable as possible, or you can choose to resist and make it worse." She let that hang in the humid Georgia air for a moment. "Sergeant Patterson will assign work details. You will work, but the work will be fair. You will rest. You will eat. And you will be safe. That is my guarantee to you." When Sarah turned to leave the yard, she felt the weight of their stares on her back. She knew that nothing she'd said would immediately change their minds, but she'd planted a seed. She'd introduced the possibility that not all their captors were monsters, that there might be someone in this system willing to treat them like men instead of like animals. It was a beginning. That night, Sergeant Patterson came to her office. "Ma'am, the men are eating more since your speech, all of them, even the ones who hadn't been eating." Sarah looked up from her paperwork. What do you think that means? Patterson scratched his head, struggling with the question. I think maybe they believed what you said, that they'd be treated fair. Good, Sarah said, because I meant it, and I need you to mean it too, Sergeant. These men are under my watch. Anything that happens to them reflects on me. I need to be able to trust that you understand that. Patterson nodded slowly. Yes, ma'am, I understand. It wasn't enthusiasm, but it was acceptance. Sarah had just taken her first step toward changing the culture of Compound C. She had no idea it would lead to far more than that. Over the next few weeks, Sarah established new protocols. She instituted a system where she personally reviewed medical reports. She checked the quality and quantity of food being served. She created a work schedule that rotated the prisoners through different tasks so no one man bore the entire burden. She made sure the latrines were cleaned regularly and maintained. She established a time each evening when the prisoners could write letters home, even though she knew it might be months or years before those letters were delivered. The other officers thought she was wasting her time. Some of them suggested to her face that she was being soft on the enemy. But the reports from Compound C began to change. There were no more escape attempts. The assault rate dropped to 0. Morale among the guards improved because they weren't dealing with constant tension and resistance. The prisoners' health improved because they were being fed properly and receiving adequate medical care. And most importantly, something that Sarah hadn't anticipated began to happen. The prisoners started to trust her. One afternoon in early August, a prisoner named Takeshi Yamamoto came to her office. He was a young man, probably in his mid-20s, who had been a junior officer before his capture. He spoke broken English, which was how Sarah first learned that he understood what she said during her initial speech. Captain Mitchell, he said carefully, his accent thick but his words deliberate. I come to thank you for the treatment, for the respect. Sarah was struck by this. She had done nothing extraordinary. She had simply treated these men like human beings instead of animals, and for that, Yamamoto felt the need to express gratitude. You're welcome, Yamamoto, she said. How are you managing? I am thinking I will survive this, he said. It was perhaps the most hopeful thing any of the prisoners had said since their arrival. I am thinking I will see my family again. Before I did not think this. That night, Sarah sat alone in her quarters and allowed herself to cry for just a moment. Tears of frustration, tears of satisfaction, tears of exhaustion. She thought about what Yamamoto had said. Before her arrival, he had believed he would not survive. He had been living each day in a state of despair so deep that survival felt impossible. And all it had taken to change, that was one person choosing to treat him like he mattered. But Sarah didn't know yet that her work was just beginning. She didn't know that the real test was coming. She didn't know that in a matter of weeks, something would happen that would force her to choose between following orders and doing what was right. She didn't know that one small act of kindness, one single burger, would upend everything she had built and force her to fight against her own military to protect men who weren't even her country's soldiers. All she knew on that humid August night in Georgia was that she had found her purpose. August turned to September and Compound C settled into a rhythm. Sarah had implemented systems that worked. The prisoners were stable, cooperative, and reasonably healthy. There had been no incidents in nearly 2 months. The escape attempts and violence that had characterized the early days had completely stopped. Sarah had even begun to understand some of the prisoners as individuals. There was Yamamoto, the junior officer who had become something of an intermediary between the Japanese men and the American command. There was Hiroshi Nakamura, a sensitive man of perhaps 40 who had been a teacher before the war and who had begun helping the younger prisoners deal with their trauma by organizing quiet meditation sessions in the yard. There was Kenji Matsuda, a 19-year-old kid who should have been worrying about school exams and girls, but who instead seemed to have aged a decade in his few months of captivity. Sarah knew she shouldn't develop personal feelings for the prisoners. It was against regulation. It was against protocol. It was considered by many in the military to be a form of treason. But she couldn't help seeing them as individual men, each with his own story, his own fears, his own humanity. One of the reasons Compound C had become so peaceful was that Sarah had worked with the camp nutritionist to improve the quality of meals. She understood that food was more than just sustenance to prisoners who had been traumatized. It was a sign that they were valued, that someone cared about their well-being. On Sundays, Sarah had arranged for the prisoners to receive slightly better meals, an extra serving of vegetables, occasional fruit when it was available. It was this decision that led to the incident that would change everything. In mid-September, a shipment of hamburger meat arrived at the base. It was meant for the officers' mess and the base personnel. These were American soldiers, and American soldiers got better food. That was simply how things worked. The hamburgers were being prepared for the officers' dinner on Friday night. Sarah happened to be in the kitchen that afternoon reviewing inventory records. She watched as the cook, a cheerful man named Private Wilson, prepared for the dinner service. There were dozens of hamburger patties being prepared, seasoned with salt and pepper, grilled to a perfect medium. Sarah's mind did the mathematics instantly. There was enough food here to feed all 23 prisoners an additional meal. Just one hamburger each. It would be a tiny fraction of what was being prepared, and the waste after the officers' dinner would likely be substantial anyway. Some of that meat would probably end up thrown away. It was a small thing, a kind thing, a thing that would bring genuine joy to men who had eaten nothing but government-issue rations and potatoes for months. It was also, Sarah knew, against regulations. Prisoners weren't supposed to eat the same food as American soldiers. There was a hierarchy, a system, and officers certainly weren't supposed to circumvent it based on personal feelings about the welfare of enemy soldiers. Sarah told herself she would think about it. She didn't make a decision right then. She left the kitchen and returned to her office. But as she sat at her desk reviewing reports, she found herself thinking about what Yamamoto had said. "I am thinking I will survive this. I am thinking I will see my family again." How many of these men had come to her compound believing they would die? How many of them had been living in a state of complete despair? And how many times had she been told that treating them decently was somehow a betrayal of her own country? Sarah made a decision. She found Private Wilson in the kitchen late that afternoon. "How much meat will be left over from the officers' dinner?" she asked casually. Wilson looked up from his prep work. "Oh, probably quite a bit, Captain. Officers never eat as much as you'd think. There's always waste." "What happens to the waste?" "Gets thrown out mostly. Sometimes the guards will eat it if it's still warm. Otherwise, garbage." Sarah nodded slowly. "What if I told you I'd like to save some of it for the prisoners?" Wilson's cheerful expression didn't change. He was a simple man, the kind of soldier who followed orders and didn't ask a lot of complicated questions. "Sure thing, Captain. How much?" "Just some of the excess," Sarah said. "After the dinner is done, you could wrap it up for me." "No problem at all," Wilson said. Sarah walked out of the kitchen knowing that she had just crossed a line. It was a small line. It was a line drawn in food and kindness rather than in blood or betrayal. But it was still a line, and once you crossed it, you could never quite cross back. Friday dinner came and went. The officers of Fort Benning ate their hamburgers and drank their coffee and talked about the war. Sarah attended, sitting at the table with men who considered her somewhat of a curiosity, a female officer who had somehow managed not to completely fail at her job. She said little and listened more. Around her, the men discussed troop movements and reports from the Pacific and the prospects for the war ending in the next year or two. No one mentioned compounds, no one asked how the prisoners were doing. They were out of sight, and therefore out of mind. After the dinner concluded, Sarah made her way back to the kitchen under the pretense of checking on supplies. Private Wilson was there, and he had done exactly as she'd asked. There were 8 hamburger patties wrapped carefully in brown paper, still warm. "Got a few more than you might have expected," Wilson said with a knowing wink. "Officers don't eat as much as people think." Sarah took the package. "Thank you, Wilson, this was kind of you." "Not a problem, Captain. Those men are just soldiers, really. Captured soldiers. Seems fair they should eat decent once in a while." Sarah left through a side exit, moving quickly but not so quickly as to draw attention. She carried the package to her office, where she carefully unwrapped the burgers. They were still warm, and they smelled wonderful. She had been so focused on the ethics of what she was doing that she hadn't really considered one simple fact. She was about to make a group of men incredibly happy. She had never given prisoners contraband before. She had never violated regulations so directly. But as she stood there holding those hamburgers, she felt something shift inside her. She felt a profound sense of rightness about what she was doing. These men weren't getting anything they didn't deserve. They were just getting something they weren't supposed to have. Sarah made her way to Compound C as dusk was settling over the base. The prisoners would be finishing their evening meal by now, probably sitting in small groups before the lights were ordered out for the night. Sergeant Patterson was making his evening rounds. "Captain," he said, surprised to see her at this hour. "Everything all right?" "Fine, Sergeant. I just wanted to check on something." Sarah held up the brown package. "I'd like to give this to the men. They've been cooperating well, following regulations, maintaining discipline. I thought a reward was in order." Patterson looked at the package with interest. "What is it?" "Hamburgers from the officers' mess. There was excess from dinner." Sarah could see the thought process happening on Patterson's face. He was trying to determine if this was within regulation. It wasn't. But he was also a man who had come to respect Sarah's judgment about how Compound C should be run. And he was a man who, despite his gruff exterior, wasn't entirely without heart. "The men will be pleased," he said finally. "Please distribute them," Sarah said, handing him the package. "Tell them it's a reward for good conduct. Tell them that as long as they continue to follow the rules, there will be occasional extras like this." It was partly true and partly a lie. Sarah didn't know if she would be able to do this again. She didn't know if she'd been smart to do it even this once. But she had done it, and now she was going to live with the consequences. What Sarah didn't know was that she was being watched. Sergeant Major Vincent Blackwell had arrived at Fort Benning just 3 weeks prior. He was a hard man from a hard place, a career soldier who had made his name by running what he called tight prisoner-of-war compounds. Tight meant discipline. Tight meant hierarchy. Tight meant that prisoners were kept at arm's length, treated as the enemy, reminded constantly of their status as captives. He did not approve of Compound C. He had observed Captain Mitchell's methods from a distance, noting with disapproval how the prisoners seemed to gather around her during her inspections, how they seemed calmer and more cooperative than prisoners should be. He had filed reports noting the excellent conditions of the compound and what he termed potentially excessive leniency toward enemy combatants. His reports had been largely ignored. The base commander was satisfied with Compound C's performance. There had been no incidents, no escapes, no violence. By every measurable standard, Sarah's methods were working better than the traditional approach. But on the night she delivered the hamburgers, Sergeant Major Blackwell saw it happen. He was on his way to meet with the commandant and had taken a shortcut through the compound area. He saw Sarah's car. He saw her hand a package to Sergeant Patterson. He saw the prisoners unwrap the burgers and actually smile. He saw them eat American food, the same food American soldiers ate. And he saw it as a violation worthy of official action. By the next morning, Sarah's phone was ringing. She was being summoned to the commandant's office immediately. Colonel Henderson was not alone when she arrived. With him were Sergeant Major Blackwell and a captain named Douglas Matthews from prisoner-of-war administration. Sarah recognized the look on their faces. It was the look of men who had found something they could use to hurt you. "Captain Mitchell," Colonel Henderson began, and Sarah could already hear the change in his tone from their first meeting. "We need to discuss your conduct as commander of Compound C." Sarah's heart was racing, but she kept her voice level. "Yes, sir." "It has been reported to me," Henderson continued, "that you have been distributing American food stores to enemy prisoners. Food that was prepared for American personnel. Is this report accurate?" There was no point in denying it. Blackwell had clearly seen what happened. "Yes, sir. Yesterday evening I provided excess hamburger meat from the officers' dinner to Compound C. It was going to be discarded otherwise." "Is it or is it not true," Matthews interjected, "that prisoners of war are not authorized to consume the same rations as American military personnel?" "That is correct," Sarah said. "However, the meat in question was excess. It was." "I don't care if it was excess," Blackwell said, his voice hard. "Regulations are regulations. They exist for a reason. When you start making exceptions, you start compromising discipline. You start signaling to the prisoners that they're not really the enemy. You start breaking down the hierarchy that keeps you safe." Sarah turned to face Blackwell directly. "With respect, Sergeant Major, the hierarchy at Compound C has been extremely effective. We've had 0 incidents in 8 weeks. 0 escape attempts. 0 violence. Our prisoners are healthy, cooperative, and compliant." "Because you've coddled them," Blackwell shot back. "Because you've treated them like they're your friends instead of your enemy. That's not military discipline, Captain. That's a failure of command." Colonel Henderson raised his hand. Captain Mitchell, I need to know. Are you aware that what you did violates Geneva Convention protocols regarding prisoner distribution of rations? Sarah's mind raced. She knew the Geneva Convention provided guidelines for feeding prisoners, and she also knew that she had not violated any of those protocols. The prisoners were still receiving their standard rations. She had merely given them extra food that was going to be wasted. But she also understood that this nuance might not matter to men who had already decided she'd done something wrong. Sir, respectfully, the additional food was provided in excess of their standard rations. Their regular meals have not been reduced or altered. I was simply preventing waste. You were also, Matthews said coldly, making a decision about resource distribution that is not within your authority to make. Food supplies are allocated through official channels. If you believe prisoners should receive additional rations, you file a report. You don't take it upon yourself to circumvent the system. Sarah felt the ground shifting beneath her. She had expected to be reprimanded, perhaps. But this felt like something more than that. This felt like they were building a case against her. I take responsibility for my actions, Sarah said carefully. However, I would argue that my primary responsibility is to the safety and well-being of compound. See, the additional food posed no security threat. It did not compromise any regulation that affects prisoner safety or base security. Your responsibility, Blackwell said, is to follow orders and maintain discipline. That's all. Everything else is secondary. Colonel Henderson stood up, and Sarah knew the conversation was over. Captain Mitchell, you're being reassigned, effective immediately. You will turn over command of Compound C to Sergeant Major Blackwell. You will hand over all files, all protocols, all records. You are dismissed. Sarah felt as though she'd been punched in the stomach. Sir, That's all, Captain. She saluted and turned to leave, but she couldn't help herself. She looked back at Blackwell and she met his eyes. Those men are going to suffer now, she said quietly. You know that, don't you? Everything they've begun to recover from, everything they've started to trust, you're going to destroy it. And for what? A couple of hamburgers. Blackwell's face darkened. Get out of my sight, Captain, before I have you up on charges for insubordination. Sarah left the office feeling hollowed out. She had known that doing the right thing might have consequences, but she hadn't fully prepared herself for how quickly those consequences would come, or how completely she would be erased. That afternoon, she spent several hours handing over the files and records to Blackwell. She explained the system she had put in place. She introduced him to the key prisoners, including Yamamoto, who had become important to the compound's functioning. Blackwell listened with barely concealed contempt, making it clear that he considered all of Sarah's protocols to be failures of discipline that he would now correct. As Sarah was packing up her personal items from the Compound C office, Yamamoto appeared at the door. He looked terrified and confused. Captain Mitchell, he said, the sergeant major say you go, this is true. Sarah couldn't lie to him. Yes, I'm being reassigned. I'm very sorry, Yamamoto. I'm sorry about this. What happened? Yamamoto asked. What go wrong? Nothing went wrong, Sarah said. She looked at this young man who had learned to hope again under her command, and she made a decision. I broke a rule to help you. They didn't like that, but it doesn't matter why now. It's done. Yamamoto looked stricken. You in trouble because of hamburger. So he had known, of course he had known. Yes, because of that, but don't worry, you're going to be fine. Just follow the rules and be careful. As she watched Yamamoto's face, Sarah saw the hope begin to drain from it again. She saw the fear return to his eyes, and she understood in that moment the true cost of what had happened. It wasn't just her loss of command. It was what it meant to the prisoners. It was the message it sent: being kind is dangerous. Treating people decently is punished. The world is indifferent to your suffering, and anyone foolish enough to care about you will be erased. That night, Sarah sat in her quarters and allowed herself to feel the full weight of her anger. She had done nothing wrong. She had, in fact, done something that every measure of military effectiveness confirmed was right. The prisoners were healthier, more cooperative, less prone to violence. Her methods were working. But she had violated an invisible rule. She had treated the prisoners like men instead of like enemies, and for that, she had been cast out. Sarah pulled out a pen and paper. She began to write down everything, every detail of what had happened, every report she had submitted, every metric of success she could point to, every regulation that she had, in fact, not violated. She was going to document everything because she had a feeling that what was about to happen in Compound C was going to need evidence. By dawn, she had filled 20 pages, and she was only just beginning to understand what she would have to do to expose the truth about what was happening there. Within 2 weeks of Sergeant Major Blackwell taking command of Compound C, everything Sarah had built began to crumble. The first sign was the reports of increased illness. Men who had been recovering started to deteriorate. Nakamura, the former teacher who had organized meditation sessions, developed a severe infection from an untreated cut on his foot. Kenji, the 19-year-old, stopped eating again, much like he had done when he first arrived. Yamamoto came down with what appeared to be dysentery. The second sign was the violence. On Blackwell's third day in command, one of the younger prisoners was beaten by a guard. The official report said the prisoner had become disruptive and non-compliant. When Sarah managed to see the prisoner through a fence during one of her walks, he was walking with a severe limp and had bruises on his face. The third sign was the silence. Prisoners who had been learning to communicate, who had been participating in work details and compound maintenance, now sat in sullen groups, speaking to no one if they could help it. The trust that Sarah had carefully built over months had been replaced by fear. Sarah reported what she was seeing to the base command, but her reports seemed to disappear into the bureaucratic void. She was no longer an officer with authority. She was a captain without command, assigned to administrative work in the personnel office. Her voice carried far less weight now. More than that, she had become suspicious. Some of the men she worked with began to act differently around her. She overheard conversations that stopped abruptly when she entered a room. She was being marked as the officer who had gone soft on prisoners, who had compromised discipline to satisfy some misguided humanitarian impulse. It was Sergeant Patterson who first came to her with the real evidence of what was happening. He appeared at her office door on a Friday evening when most personnel had left for the day. He looked uncomfortable and nervous, which was unusual for the experienced sergeant. "Can we talk, Captain?" he asked quietly. "Somewhere private." Sarah gestured for him to come in and close the door. "Of course, Sergeant. What's wrong?" Patterson sat down heavily. "I've been transferred. Blackwell is getting rid of anyone who worked under your command. He says we're contaminated with your soft approach. I'm being moved to a different compound, effective immediately." "I'm sorry to hear that," Sarah said, and she meant it. Patterson had been decent, more decent than many career military men she'd worked with. He had come to understand her approach and to support it, even when it went against his initial instincts. "There's more," Patterson continued, lowering his voice even though they were alone. "Captain, what's happening in that compound now? It's not right. The men are being worked too hard. The food rations have been cut. Medical care is being denied to prisoners who actually need it. And the guards are being encouraged to use more force than necessary for discipline." Sarah leaned forward. "I suspected as much. I've heard rumors. I haven't been able to confirm details." "I can confirm them," Patterson said, "because I witnessed it. Yesterday, a prisoner named Hiroshi, the older man, the quiet one, he asked to see the medic. He was in real pain. The guard told him to stop complaining about minor things. Hiroshi asked again. The guard beat him, Captain, just beat him. And when I said something, Blackwell told me it was necessary discipline." Sarah felt rage building inside her, but she kept her voice steady. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you cared about those men," Patterson said. "And because I think what's happening is wrong. I couldn't say that when Blackwell was testing my loyalty. But now that I'm being transferred anyway, I figure I might as well tell the truth to someone who might actually do something about it." "What I can do is limited," Sarah said. "I'm not in command anymore. My reports aren't being taken seriously." "Then take it higher," Patterson said. "Take it all the way up. The Geneva Convention is part of international law. What Blackwell is doing violates that. It violates military regulations. Someone has to make it official." After Patterson left, Sarah sat alone in her office for a long time. She pulled out the documentation she had been compiling. 20 pages had become 50 pages. She had copies of every report she'd submitted about Compound C. She had statements from other soldiers about changes they'd noticed. She had her own observations dating back to the day she arrived. But she had no official authority to launch an investigation. She was a female captain without command in a military that was already skeptical of her judgment. If she went public with accusations against a superior officer, a sergeant major with decades of experience, She would be fighting an uphill battle against institutional loyalty, against sexism, against the military's general instinct to protect its own. It was then that Sarah made the decision that would change everything. She would go outside the chain of command. There was a newspaper in the town nearest to Fort Benning, the Marietta Daily Times. It was a small-town paper, the kind that covered local news and public interest stories. It also had a principle that Sarah needed. They investigated claims of public malfeasance. They believed that government institutions needed to be held accountable to the public. On her next day off, Sarah drove into town in civilian clothes. She parked her car a few blocks away from the newspaper office and walked there carefully, making sure no one from the base would see her. The office was small and modest, filled with the sound of typewriters and the smell of ink. The editor was a man named Robert Chen, perhaps in his early 50s, with intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. Sarah asked to speak to him privately, and he led her to a small, cluttered office in the back. "My name is Captain Sarah Mitchell," she said. She decided immediately to be honest about who she was and what she was doing. "I serve at Fort Benning. I'm here because I believe that war crimes are being committed at the base against Japanese prisoners of war, and the military command is covering it up." Chen leaned back in his chair, studying her carefully. "That's a serious accusation, Captain. Why come to me?" "Because I've exhausted the official channels," Sarah said. "Because I'm a female officer without command, and my accusations against a respected sergeant major won't be taken seriously by the military hierarchy. And because the public has a right to know if their government is violating international law." "What kind of war crimes are we talking about?" Chen asked. Sarah laid out everything. She described the conditions that had existed before Blackwell arrived and the conditions now. She described the beatings. She described the reduced food rations. She described the denial of medical care. She described the systematic degradation of men who were prisoners of war and protected under the Geneva Convention. Chen listened carefully, making notes. When she finished, he asked, "Can you provide documentation?" Sarah pulled out her carefully compiled papers. She showed him reports, dates, names. She showed him entries from her personal log describing what she had observed. She gave him everything except the one thing she couldn't afford to lose, her own copy. "This is circumstantial in places," Chen said, "but there are enough specifics here to warrant investigation. Captain, I need to ask you something. Are you aware of the professional risk you're taking?" "Yes," Sarah said. "If this becomes public and I'm identified as the source, I'll likely face disciplinary action, possibly court-martial for various charges related to releasing classified or confidential information." "Why are you doing it?" Sarah thought about Yamamoto, she thought about Kenji, she thought about Nakamura and all the others. "Because if I don't, no one will, and because those men trusted me to protect them. I failed to do that, but I can still try to stop the abuse." Chen nodded slowly. "I'll look into this. I'll investigate independently, talk to people, verify what I can. If I can corroborate your story, I'll publish. But I'm going to protect your identity. You'll be described as a military source, not named." "I appreciate that," Sarah said. She understood that anonymity might protect her somewhat, but she also knew that eventually the truth would come out. The military would suspect who the leak came from. Her anonymity would buy her time, but not safety. Over the next 2 weeks, reporter Robert Chen dug deeper. He talked to civilians who worked at the base. He talked to family members of soldiers who had written home about rumors they'd heard. He even managed to talk to a doctor who worked at the base medical clinic, who confirmed that Blackwell had been restricting medical care to prisoners. The investigation seemed to be moving forward. And then everything fell apart. Sarah received a summons to Colonel Henderson's office. She arrived at 600 hours to find Henderson, 2 officers she didn't recognize, and Sergeant Major Blackwell all waiting for her. "Captain Mitchell," Henderson said gravely, "we have reason to believe you have been in contact with a civilian reporter regarding classified military operations." Sarah's heart sank, they knew. "There's an active investigation," one of the officers she didn't recognize continued. He introduced himself as Major Sullivan from Military Intelligence. "A reporter named Robert Chen has been making inquiries about prisoner treatment at this base. We have reason to believe you are his source." "I have nothing to say without representation," Sarah said. "You're not under arrest," Sullivan said. We're conducting an administrative inquiry. Cooperation would be in your best interest. But Sarah had learned enough about military law to know that anything she said could be used against her. She remained silent. Your silence is noted, Sullivan said. Captain, you're being suspended from duty effective immediately, pending the results of this investigation. You'll be confined to the base. You'll surrender your sidearm. You're not to leave your quarters except for legal proceedings and necessary meals. It was suspension. It was the military equivalent of house arrest. It was also, Sarah understood, exactly what would happen to a woman officer who challenged the system. As she left the office, she could feel Blackwell's satisfied gaze on her back. He had won. He had forced her silence and isolated her. But something he didn't know was that the truth had already started spreading. The article had been delayed, held up by legal review, but it was going to run. The question was whether it would run before she was court-martialed and discredited. That night, confined to her quarters, Sarah sat on her narrow military bed and waited. Outside her window, the Georgia heat pressed down on the base. Somewhere in Compound C, the prisoners were suffering under Blackwell's regime. And somewhere in a newspaper office, a story was being prepared that might just change everything. Sarah had sacrificed her career, her freedom, possibly her future. She had done it to protect men who weren't even her countrymen. She had done it because she couldn't live with herself if she didn't. The article appeared on a Sunday morning in the Marietta Daily Times. It ran on the front page, above the fold, with the headline, "War Crimes Alleged at Fort Benning Prisoner Compound." Reporter Robert Chen had done thorough work. The article detailed the change in conditions at Compound C following Sergeant Major Blackwell's arrival. It described specific incidents of abuse. It included statements from medical personnel about denials of care. It included testimony from other soldiers who had witnessed beatings and other mistreatment. Most importantly, it included detailed documentation of regulations and Geneva Convention provisions that appeared to have been violated. The article didn't identify Sarah by name, but it made clear that a military source with direct knowledge of the compound had provided the information. Within hours of the article's publication, all hell broke loose. Major Sullivan arrived at Sarah's quarters with a set of documents. "You're being charged with violation of the Uniform Code of Military Justice, Article 134, regarding disloyal statements and conduct," he said coldly. "Specifically, you're accused of releasing classified information to a civilian reporter without authorization. Additionally, you're being charged with conduct detrimental to good order and discipline." Sarah was escorted from her quarters to a holding area where she was informed that she was to be court-martialed. A military lawyer was assigned to her, a middle-aged captain named James Morrison, who seemed exhausted by life and the military in equal measure. "They're going to throw the book at you," Morrison told her. "Disloyal statements is serious. If convicted, you could face years in prison." "Did I lie?" Sarah asked. "That's not relevant to the charge," Morrison said. "Truth is not a defense against violating military regulations regarding disclosure of information. So I'm being court-martialed for telling the truth about war crimes." "You're being court-martialed for violating the chain of command," Morrison corrected. "For taking military matters to a civilian reporter instead of handling them through proper channels. The military doesn't care if what you said is true or false. They care that you violated regulation." Sarah felt a moment of despair. She had known this was possible. She had known that the system would protect itself. But sitting in this small holding area, listening to her lawyer explain that the truth didn't matter, that her only crime was breaking the rules even though the rules protected abuse, she felt the weight of it fully. And then something unexpected happened. The public didn't go along with the military's narrative. Local churches began to organize. Community members who had read the article about abuse of prisoners of war were outraged. How could American soldiers abuse men who had already surrendered, who were protected by international law? The newspapers picked up the story. Other journalists began to investigate. The story expanded beyond the Marietta Daily Times to papers across Georgia and then across the country. A congressman whose district included Fort Benning received hundreds of letters from constituents demanding an investigation. A senator who had been pushing for better adherence to Geneva Convention standards saw an opportunity and called for a military inquiry. The War Department, suddenly facing public scrutiny and potential international embarrassment, ordered an investigation. 3 days after Sarah's arrest, a team of investigators arrived at Fort Benning. They weren't there to support Blackwell. They were there because the military's leadership understood that the situation was becoming a public relations disaster. Over the course of a week, these investigators spoke to dozens of people. They examined medical records. They visited Compound C and spoke to prisoners, some of whom were terrified and some of whom were angry enough to tell the truth. They interviewed guards and other personnel who had witnessed abuse but felt powerless to stop it. And then they published their findings. The investigation confirmed nearly everything in Robert Chen's article. It documented systematic abuse. It documented violations of the Geneva Convention. It documented the degradation of conditions following Blackwell's arrival compared to conditions under Sarah's command. Critically, the investigation also concluded that the abuses had occurred with Blackwell's knowledge and approval, that he had created an environment where such treatment was encouraged, that his explicit orders had sometimes been to use force beyond what was necessary or appropriate. Sergeant Major Blackwell was removed from command. He was formally charged with mistreatment of prisoners of war. His case was referred for court-martial. And Sarah Mitchell's charges were quietly dropped. There was no formal apology. There was no public acknowledgement that she had been right, but she was released from the holding area. She was restored to active duty. And Colonel Henderson, when he saw her, suddenly became very interested in anything except meeting her eyes. Sarah's first action as a restored officer was to request assignment to Compound C to oversee the reversal of Blackwell's policies. Her request was granted immediately. She suspected the military command wanted to make things right as quickly and quietly as possible. When she walked through the gate of Compound C, she saw the damage that had been done in her absence. The prisoners were thin. Many bore marks of old beatings. Their eyes carried a hollowed-out expression that she had worked for months to erase. They gathered around her, hope and wariness mixed together in their faces. Yamamoto came forward slowly, as if he couldn't quite believe what he was seeing. "Captain Mitchell," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "you come back." "I come back," Sarah confirmed, "and I'm going to fix what was broken, I promise you that." For the next 6 weeks, Sarah implemented the system she had developed before. The food improved, the medical care increased, the work details became fair again. Slowly, gradually, the prisoners' health and morale began to recover. It wasn't perfect. The damage had been done. Some of the trust they'd built had been lost. But what Sarah had learned was that it could be rebuilt, that people had resilience, that hope could return even after it seemed to be gone forever. She also worked with legal authorities to ensure that Blackwell's abuse was documented in a way that would be preserved in his record. She gave testimony to the military attorneys handling his court-martial. She provided evidence of his policies and decisions. In November 1944, Sergeant Major Vincent Blackwell was convicted of mistreatment of prisoners of war. He was dishonorably discharged from the Army. He would spend the rest of his life marked by this conviction, unable to hide from what he had done. Justice, such as it was, had been served. But for Sarah, the real victory wasn't Blackwell's conviction. It was the moment when Nakamura, the former teacher, came to her with tears in his eyes. "I think I will live," he said in his careful English. "I think I will see Japan again. I think I will hold my daughter. I thought this not possible before, but now I think it possible." Sarah put her hand on his shoulder. "You will," she said. "I promise you will." The rest of 1944 and into 1945, Sarah maintained command of Compound C. The news of what had happened spread through military channels. A female officer had challenged the system, had been vindicated, and had forced accountability. In some quarters, this was celebrated as a victory for proper military conduct. In others, it was viewed with deep suspicion, a reminder of the dangers of allowing women into positions of real authority. Sarah ignored both sides and focused on what mattered, the welfare of the men under her command. As 1945 progressed, the war in Europe came to an end. The war in the Pacific continued, brutal and grinding, but everyone knew it was only a matter of time. The prisoners at Compound C received news from home, letters that gradually became less frequent as Japan prepared for what seemed like the end. Yamamoto was promoted within the prisoner hierarchy to assist with maintaining morale and discipline among the Japanese men. Kenji, The young 19-year-old began to teach other prisoners basic English. Nakamura, despite his age and his injuries, became a source of emotional support for men struggling with despair. In many ways, Compound C became less a prisoner of war facility and more a community of men bound together by their circumstances, guided by an officer who had proven she would fight for their dignity. But with all of this success came new challenges for Sarah. Word had spread about her conduct, and there were those in the military hierarchy who were deeply uncomfortable with what she represented. There was a movement among some senior officers to have her transferred. The excuse given was that she was too close to the prisoners, that she had allowed personal relationships to compromise her judgment, that she was unfit for continued command. Sarah received a formal notice in April 1945 informing her that her command was being transferred to a more experienced officer, and that she was being assigned to administrative duties at base headquarters, effective immediately. Sarah read the notice and felt a complex mix of emotions. She had known this was coming. She had done too much to challenge the system. She had won too publicly against men who had significant influence and pride at stake. The military was going to reassign her, bury her, make her irrelevant. But before she could despair, something unexpected happened. The prisoners organized. Yamamoto and several other senior prisoners went to the guards and requested a meeting with the new commanding officer who was arriving to take over Compound C. They asked permission to submit a formal statement regarding their experience under Captain Mitchell's command. The request traveled up the chain of command, and somewhere in that chain, someone decided that denying it would look worse than allowing it. The new commanding officer, a Colonel Robert Ashford, arrived to take command and found himself faced with 23 prisoners who had prepared a detailed written statement about their treatment under Captain Mitchell. The statement was respectful, formal, and damning in its implications. If Colonel Ashford immediately began to mistreat the prisoners as Blackwell had done, it would be clear that he was undoing the work of a good officer for political reasons. Colonel Ashford did something unexpected. He read the statement. He spoke privately with Yamamoto and several other prisoners, and then he made a decision. He went to Colonel Henderson and told him that he had reviewed the compound and found Captain Mitchell's systems to be effective and humane. He recommended that she remain in command, or if the military hierarchy insisted on reassignment, that her replacement maintain her protocols. More than that, he told Henderson that removing Captain Mitchell would demoralize the prisoners and potentially create disciplinary problems. That continuity of command was important. That the Geneva Convention required humane treatment, and humane treatment required consistency and experienced leadership. Whether Henderson believed this or not, he recognized that pushing the issue would create more problems than it solved. A female captain maintaining effective command of a prisoner compound that received occasional press attention was better than creating a new incident by clearly demoting her for political reasons. Sarah's transfer was canceled. Her command was extended, and a precedent had been set. You couldn't easily remove an officer whose effectiveness had been proven and validated by both military performance metrics and, more importantly, by the prisoners themselves. It wasn't a victory, it was something more subtle. It was an agreement to let her do her job. As the war continued through the spring and summer of 1945, Sarah began to think about what would happen when the war ended. The prisoners of war would eventually be repatriated to Japan. Compound C would close. She would move on to whatever assignment the military had in mind for a female officer with a controversial record. But in June 1945, something changed. Robert Chen, the newspaper reporter who had investigated the abuse in Compound C, came to the base to do a follow-up story. He wanted to interview Sarah about the compound's current status and about what had happened since the original article. They met in a small office, away from the bustle of the main administrative building. "The story is remarkable," Chen said. "You took a significant personal risk. You were going to be court-martialed. You had nothing to gain and everything to lose." "I had to do it," Sarah said simply. "I couldn't live with myself otherwise." "Has it been worth it?" Chen asked. Sarah thought about that. Had sacrificing her safety and security, had risking her entire career been worth it? She thought about Yamamoto, who had told her he now believed he would survive and see his daughter again. She thought about Kenji, who was no longer refusing to eat, who was learning English, who had something to live for. She thought about Nakamura, who had told her that because of her, He now believed in the fundamental dignity of man again. "Yes," she said, "it has been worth it." Chen published his follow-up article in September 1945, right as the war ended and Japan surrendered. The article was titled, "The Officer Who Fought for Prisoners' Rights." It told the full story of what Sarah had done and what she had risked. It detailed her vindication and her continued command of Compound C. More importantly, the article became a historical record. It preserved the story for future generations. It made it impossible for what had happened to be forgotten or rewritten. The war ended in September 1945. By December, most of the Japanese prisoners of war had been processed for repatriation. Compound C was being dismantled. The prisoner barracks were being cleaned out and prepared for new uses. The barbed wire fences would soon come down. Sarah stood in her office on a cold December morning reviewing the final reports. Nearly 23 men had spent months in her care. Most of them were healthy now. All of them were alive. All of them would be going home. She had been given a new assignment. She would be transferred to a base in Virginia, where she would oversee a prisoner reintegration program for soldiers returning from Europe. It was actually a good assignment, a reflection of her proven competence and the value the military now recognized she held. But before she left Fort Benning, there was one final task. Yamamoto came to her office on their last day. He was in civilian clothes now. The prisoners were being released in stages, transported to ports where they would board ships back to Japan. "I want to thank you," he said carefully in his steady English. "I want to thank you for giving us hope when there was no hope, for treating us like men when we were treated like animals. You change my life, Captain Mitchell. You change all our lives." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. "You changed my life too," she said. "You reminded me why I became an officer, to protect people, to do what's right even when it's hard." "I will tell people in Japan," Yamamoto said. "I will tell my daughter about the American officer who cared. And maybe, someday, America and Japan will be friends again. And people will remember that it started with one person choosing to be kind." After Yamamoto left, Sarah sat alone in her office for a long time. She thought about everything that had happened in the past year, the risks she had taken, the losses she had endured, the victory she had won. And then something remarkable occurred to her. If asked, most of the military brass at Fort Benning would have told anyone who asked that Captain Sarah Mitchell was a problem, that she was a difficult woman who had challenged the system unnecessarily, that she had put her own ideals above the mission, that she was not someone to be trusted with significant responsibility. But the record showed something else entirely. The record showed that under her command, Compound C had been the most stable and effective prisoner facility in the entire base, that she had prevented abuses through her leadership, that when abuse did occur, she had been willing to risk everything to expose it. The record showed that she had done exactly what a military officer was supposed to do: lead with integrity, protect those under her command, and hold the system accountable when it failed. And now, as she left Fort Benning for the next chapter of her military career, she understood that this record would follow her. Some officers would hold it against her, some would respect it, but it couldn't be denied or hidden. Sarah had won something that no one could take away. She had won the truth. 3 years later, in 1948, Sarah was sitting in her office in Virginia when she received a letter from Japan. It was from Yamamoto. He had returned home, reunited with his family, and begun a new life as a teacher. He wrote to tell Sarah that he was working to build bridges between American and Japanese people, that he was teaching his students about compassion and the possibility of humanity in even the darkest circumstances. He told her that Kenji, the young prisoner who had refused to eat, had also made it home. He was now studying to be a doctor. Nakamura, the former teacher, had written a book about his experiences and about the one American officer who had shown him that dignity was possible. Yamamoto's letter ended with a request. He was organizing a small reunion of former prisoners of war who had been at Compound C. They wanted to formally thank Captain Sarah Mitchell for what she had done. They were raising funds to bring him to Japan to accept their gratitude in person. Sarah read the letter 3 times. She looked at the date it had been written. It was dated exactly 3 years to the day from when Blackwell had arrived at Compound C. She made a decision that day that would shape the rest of her military career. She made it official to her commanding officer that she was available to travel to Japan as part of any military exchange or goodwill program. She made it known that she was interested in prisoner rehabilitation and cross-cultural reconciliation. The military, recognizing good public relations when they saw it, approved her transfer to a new role focused on international relations and prisoner exchange programs. By 1950, Sarah was one of the highest-ranking women officers in the United States Army, leading diplomatic missions and helping to rebuild relationships between the United States and Japan. She never became a general. The military hierarchy didn't work that way for women in the 1950s, but she became something perhaps more valuable. She became a symbol that integrity mattered, that doing the right thing had consequences but also had rewards, that change was possible even within the most entrenched systems. In 1952, Sarah was officially invited to Japan by the Japanese government. She met with Yamamoto and the other surviving prisoners from Compound C. They held a ceremony where they formally thanked her for what she had done. They gave her a beautiful wooden box made by a craftsman, inside of which was a scroll with Japanese calligraphy describing her as the captain with an honest heart. Standing in that room in Japan, surrounded by men she had once been on opposite sides of a war with, Sarah understood the full arc of her journey. She had started as a woman whose abilities were doubted. She had been given an impossible assignment with the expectation that she would fail. She had chosen to do what was right instead of what was easy. She had risked everything. And in the end, she had won more than she ever expected. She had won redemption. She had won respect. She had won the knowledge that the choices she had made mattered, that one person could change the course of events, that integrity in the end was the only currency that truly held value. The military had tried to erase her, the system had tried to destroy her, but she had not been erased, she had not been destroyed, instead she had been vindicated. Captain Sarah Mitchell had come to Fort Benning as a woman who was underestimated, insulted, and mocked. She left it as an officer who had changed the course of military history in her own small way. She had proven that one woman with courage, integrity, and compassion could make a difference. And sometimes, she would reflect on how it had all started with something as simple as a hamburger, an act of kindness that had cascaded into something much larger. A reminder that even in war, even between enemies, humanity could prevail. That treating people like they mattered could literally save lives and change the course of history. The story of Compound C became part of military history. In classes about the Geneva Convention and prisoner treatment, future military officers would study what Captain Sarah Mitchell did and how she did it. She became a case study in ethical command. She became proof that the right thing to do was also the effective thing to do. Sarah Mitchell completed her military career with honor and distinction. She retired in 1960 as a colonel, one of the first women to achieve that rank in the United States Army. She spent her retirement writing about military ethics and the importance of treating prisoners of war humanely. But the thing she was most proud of, the thing she would talk about when people asked about her career, was the day she gave hamburgers to prisoners of war and chose to do what was right instead of what was easy. Because she understood that sometimes redemption doesn't come from grand gestures or military victories. Sometimes it comes from one person looking another person in the eye and deciding in that moment to choose compassion over fear, dignity over cruelty, humanity over hatred.